So in the tutorial, we're going to be looking at font types, how we go ahead and specify font types. Then we're going to take a look at font size, and then we're going to look at the shorthand way to include a font or specify a font fallbacks, things like that. So the usual. We're not going to go into anything too advanced or any CSS3 fonts. That will be later on in the series, but for now we're just going to look at the basics of implementing or specifying a font for your page. So what do we need to do? Well, the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is just create some text on a page. So I'm going to go ahead and create a paragraph element, and I'm just going to type some text in here. So this is some text on a page. Relatively straightforward. Let's go over to the browser and refresh, and you see we've got the font on the page there, or the text on the page, sorry. Now, by default, we've got the whichever font that the browser renders, the text as by default, but we want to go ahead and change this. Now, we're not going to be targeting that paragraph specifically. I'm going to be talking here about general and overall font for your page. You can go ahead and specify, individual fonts for each element, although it's not advised to have too many fonts on one page because it does tend to look quite messy, as well as too many font sizes. You should keep header sizes the same and body sizes the same, things like that. Okay, so what do we want to do? Well, we want to target our entire document, so we're going to say body, and inside here we want to go ahead and start to create some fonts, or we want to specify a font. Now there are 5 types of fonts, and that's types of font, not actual font, which is serif, sans serif, monospace, cursive, and fantasy. Now I'm not really going to be looking at monospace, cursive, and fantasy. There's ones you can go ahead and look up yourself. Fantasy is good for things like headings, etc. They're bold and a bit more unique than just your plain average fonts. Serif and sans serif vary very slightly, just in the sense that sans serif are more rounder. They don't have the serifs on the end, and they look. You'll see what I mean in a moment. Okay, so how do we go ahead and specify a font? Well, we need to do this carefully because we need to provide fallbacks for the user if a font isn't available on their system. So for example, if I wanted to choose the font Verdana, which is part of the sans serif font collection, which is the smoother, rounder, without the little pointy serifs at the end of the font, I'd have to go ahead and specify my font family to be Verdana. Now that's relatively straightforward. We just say font family like that, and then we say Verdana. Okay, I'll get rid of that space there to save a bit of data. So when I refresh, you can see that the text has changed, and it's it's a bit smoother now. I think the default for Chrome was Times New Roman, but we don't have a fallback font. What if Verdana is not available on the system? Now it's quite a widely used font, so that's fairly unlikely. But what if we do actually need a fallback? Well, in the case of a fallback, because Verdana is part of the sans serif generic font family, we go ahead and we specify sans serif. Now you can see that when we refresh, we don't have any difference. There's no difference to the font on our page. However, if we go ahead and remove Verdana, you're unlikely to see much of a difference at all. But you can see the font varies very, very slightly. It doesn't look too much different. It was just, the characters are a bit narrower, etc., etc. So if Verdana is not available, we want to really, specify the nearest available font. Now I could say, well, I might not want to default to this. Might want to default to another font. Well, in that case, you'd say Verdana, and then you would specify another. So I'm going to say Tahoma, which is another sans serif font. So when I refresh, Verdana is available on my system, but if Verdana is not available, it will default to Tahoma. So when I refresh, we get a similar looking font. Again, if Tahoma is not available, it will then default to sans serif. So this, which is extremely similar. So if this one's not available, next, it just traverses down that list, cascades down, if you like. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and just quickly look at another type, which is serif. That's like Times New Roman. Now the only problem we have with Times New Roman, say font family, is, oh, I've already given it away. So we have Times New Roman there, and we would default to serif if we couldn't, if Times New Roman, for example, wasn't available. Now Times New Roman there, you can see, let's just go ahead and get rid of that quickly. Okay, you can see that's default. You know, we've got the default font on the page, Times New Roman. For example, if Times New Roman wasn't available, we would then default to serif, okay, which is, you know, more or less similar. Now, let's take a look at Times New Roman. It does have spaces in it, so what we do need to do is go ahead and just use quotation marks around it. And let's go to our browser, refresh, nothing's changed. So yeah, so just wanted to go over one of the serif, but that's essentially it. We've got the 5 different types of font. They're called generic font families, and then we've got specific font families that are, you know, created and must be available on the user's system for them to be used. Obviously later on in CSS3, you can use, font includes, and you can include fonts that are available on that server, which or on of course on another server that have been included in. But we'll look at that a bit later on anyway. Okay, so now we want to go ahead and look at font size, and we'll go over a couple of the font sizes, the options that we've got for sizing, and what's generally advised. So let's go ahead and set a font family. So font family, I'm going to choose Arial, and that's a sans serif font, so I need to specify my sans serif fallback. And in case Arial's not doesn't exist, I'm going to go for, no, we'll go for Verdana. Now Arial does exist on my system, so my text has been set to Arial. Now I want to go ahead and I want to specify a font size. Now if you've used, say, word processors, for example, you'll probably be familiar with a PT measurement system for fonts. So you might choose a 14 or a 12 pixels default in most word processors. So you might have, say, a 12-point font, and you might go ahead and specify your font size as 12 points. So that's by default on the page anyway. Slightly larger again would be, 14. They usually go up in increments of 2. Now the problem with PT is, I personally believe it should be left in the word processor. The options that we actually have for CSS fonts are PT, which I've just briefly spoken about and told you I hate it, PX, which is usually used in CSS for measuring, say, or sizing up things like div elements, any container element or anything really. PX should generally be used. We've then got %, which is quite popular in terms of resetting font sizes, but then going on to use EMs, which I'll explain in just a moment. And then we've got EMs, which I just mentioned, but you may have not known what they are. So we've got EMs, it's EM, but they're called EMs. We've got %, pixels, and point. Now I'm going to completely ignore point, so PT. I'm going to completely ignore pixels. I'm going to talk briefly about %, and then I'm going to tell you about EM. Okay, so usually when you have a document, you want to go ahead and reset everything on it. That will be taking the borders, the margins, the padding off of divs, anything like that. Now most people would go ahead and set their font size to 62.4%. Now what that would do is it would set it quite small, but then that would generally mean, and it's not actually exact, it doesn't by all means match up exactly, and there is proof behind that, so go ahead and look that up online, that now one EM is equal to 10 pixels, and I'm not quite sure where this sort of standard came from, but generally people set the font size to 62.4%. So what they can then do is they can say, well, if I set a font to 1 EM, it will be equal to 10 pixels. If I set a font to 1.2 EM, it will be equal to 12 pixels, which is generally not actually that reliable and not that true. So really, when you set your font size, it's probably more useful to go ahead and say font size 1.2 EM. So you've got an overall general font size for your document. If you need anything smaller, you can then, not here, but in each individual, say, div container or anchor tag or anything, you could set it to a different size. So let me go ahead and set it to 1.2 EM first of all, and you can see that we've got quite a large piece of text here. So let's say we had our overall font size as 1 EM, which is a fairly standard font size for a page. You might find this a bit too big for your content, but that's fine. You could go ahead and set the font size to 1 EM as your default. You might then say, well, I want my headers, so my header 1 tags to be 1.6 EM. Okay, so when you place an H1 tag on your page for a header, just say header there, that will be obviously larger. Okay, so you've got this at 1.6 EM now. Let's go and inspect that. You can see that's 1.6, which has overridden the default 2M that's set for the user agent style sheet. So then you could obviously say span in here. You could say target a span within a paragraph, for example. So let's say P span. You could say font size 0.8 EM, and that's the beauty of using EMs. We can say 0.8, we can say 0.85, 0.08. It's extremely flexible in that way. So if I refresh now, you see that the span within here, so let's just open that paragraph down here, the span within there has been set to 0.8 pixels, whereas the rest is at 0.8 EM, where the rest is 1 EM. Okay, so that's basically it. I'm not going to go into too much detail. This should be enough to get you to create, a nice font size, specify a font with the appropriate fallback. The only other thing really is just something about saving space. So let's just go ahead and tidy our markup up back to its original state. And I'll get rid of that as well. And let's refresh our page just so we know what we're working with. Okay, so we're going to use the shorthand font property. Now, I haven't really spoken about font weight and things like that, but hopefully if you're watching this series the whole way through, you'll pick up things like font weight and text underline, which isn't strictly to do with fonts, but it does, underline a font or strike through or something like that. Anyway, let's go ahead and get rid of the font size here, and let's go ahead and get rid of this font family here. So we're just specifying font. Now let's go ahead and refresh there. You can see that we have sort of lost our styling altogether now. It's defaulted back to Times New Roman, and that's because the shorthand font property takes the minimum of two not really parameters but property values, and you want to go ahead and you want to set the size and the font in one. So there's no comma or anything required. That will sort of confuse it. We're just using spaces here. So we're saying we want our font to be 1 EM in size, our body font, and then we want these fonts here with the fallbacks appropriately written. So now when we go ahead and refresh the page, you can see that the font size, again, if we inspect this, has been set to, we'll need it under body, has been set to 1 EM, and then we've got our fonts there and the fallbacks. So that's just sort of saves a bit of space and saves you having, 2 lines of code and then having the extra family and then for the size as well. So really it's just to save a bit of space in your style sheet. It's not necessary, but it does, look a bit neater. And it's preferable to do it that way. So that's a brief introduction to fonts in CSS.